All right, so now it's time for our 3 o'clock talk with Kyle Malo. Kyle Malo is a Senior Director of Cybersecurity and Chief Information Security Officer for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. And as CISO, he leads a cybersecurity strategy and execution for the nation's second busiest transit system, a critical infrastructure system that supports over 1 million daily commuters. And WMATA's current focus is on leveraging intelligence to drive larger risk management strategies. And prior to joining WMATA, Mr. Malo served for 9 years in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, culminating as CISO, where he led enterprise global efforts to secure national security information, enabling the FBI's domestic intelligence and law enforcement missions. Mr. Malo also served in the U.S. Air Force for 8 years, culminating as Chief Intelligence Operations for Unmanned Intelligence Surveillance and Reconnaissance Group supporting global defensive missions. And with that, I'll pass it along to Kyle.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. You can hear me okay?
Yeah. Nice
All
and clear.
right. Well, this is a great opportunity. I'm glad to be able to join you guys here today, even for a little bit of time, and just talk through the program, talk through some things I think are really interesting with cybersecurity. I'm going to share my desktop here. And I should pivot that up there. Talk through where I want to focus today. I thought would be a little bit interesting, and give a particular focus on an element of cybersecurity that deals with critical infrastructure, deals with what we call operational technology and the Internet of Things, and why that really matters. And in so many ways right now, this area of technology is evolving very rapidly, and cybersecurity is just trying to keep pace with the challenges these devices face, face the world and face organizations that employ them. Let me pivot in. You did a great job on my background, so I will skip the right-hand side there and just focus a little bit on Metro so you'll understand. If you've been to Washington, D.C., you might have rode our system before. We're, as Mike said, second largest in terms of traffic and amount of railway in the nation. And where that particularly becomes interesting in the DC area is how we support the federal government. Vast majority of federal agencies are headquartered in Washington, DC. Parking is very limited like it is in any city. And so transportation, public transportation, the subway system becomes critical to actually enabling the federal government in general. The other part that's interesting, though, is that because we're in this area, in the way we're structured, our rail lines run underneath of several federal headquarters and agency headquarters. So a lot of the security concerns we have are obviously around safely moving folks, but also there's this nexus between a physical security attack, a physical attack, and physical security concerns and cyber attacks. That intersection between cyber and kinetic is kind of interesting. So we have a lot of close partnerships with law enforcement, our own police department, and so forth that kind of bring everything together. Rather large organization. We're actually getting close to around 19,000 to 20,000 employees and contractors, working with about a $3.5 billion annual operating budget. And so it's a really interesting kind of organization. The other half of what we do, though, deals with buses and paratransit. And before I delve into, because I think we've got probably a good group of folks here who may have interacted with the CISO before or may not. Generally speaking, these are the kinds of things that a CISO would be engaged in, which is holistically, especially if you're in a large organization, managing a holistic cybersecurity program is more than your traditional defensive operations, your security operations center type activities. That's what a lot of people think about. But it's all of these things. It is, tremendous amount of time spent dealing with policy and how you govern technology as a whole, as it's being deployed across an organization. This is a big challenge for any large organization or company. You've got a lot of different folks who want to do things that are going to, improve operations or improve some functionality. And this means that technology often gets deployed without cyber being aware of it. And every time that happens, it exposes the organization to a lot of risk. So governance is a really important component of a cybersecurity program. And a lot of these other things then you might be familiar with if you've been studying cybersecurity, you have an interest in it. Enterprise risk management. This is, I won't get into that too much on this presentation today, but represents a substantial component of a cyber program, is the ability to look at individual systems, applications, and infrastructure and apply security controls and tailor security controls based on the risk that technology might pose the organization, the type of data it might process. So to look at it from a rail perspective, for example, a command and control system for the actual trains is a very important system because it has safety implications, has reliability implications. A system that processes credit card information for our customers, also important, but for very different reasons. And the type of security controls you put in place look very different from one type of system to another. And of course, we have to think about your supply chain is going to be, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in this presentation today, the implications that has on, based on where you're buying, what you're buying, and how it integrates with your environment. So I like to start off most of my presentations by just kind of level setting where we all fall in the world. Critical infrastructure, as defined by the Department of Homeland Security, has 10 major components that you're seeing on the screen right now. Now, transportation is one of those, but you'll see it's a pretty broad spectrum of functions across the country. And what they all share in common, though, is that if they are incapacitated, if they are destroyed, that there is a debilitating effect on security, on national security, on economic security, and public health or safety. So in each of these areas, we want to focus on cybersecurity's requirements to protect them, to ensure that these things don't happen. And when you're in this category, it means that there tends to be a higher emphasis on compliance, on audits, or other kinds of requirements levied against you by the government, which is oftentimes tied to either funding, grants, or some other legal requirements for your organization. All right, so understanding that, again, this presentation, I want to focus more on things that you would find in maybe manufacturing, certainly obviously in transportation and several other sectors. And that is, what is the difference between when we talk about IT versus OT? Okay, IT being information technology, what most of us tend to be familiar with. It is the applications that run on your phone. It is the applications that, like Zoom, that we're on today, right? These are components of IT. They have data, they protect data, they manipulate data for some purpose. OT, on the other side, is while it's obviously technology still, it does something by and large, right? It controls something, it monitors something, right? And so, for example, an HVAC system is a type of operational technology. It is a computer, by and large now is very much computerized, that physically moves air. There are moving parts associated with the technology, or that the technology is controlling in some fashion. A rail car for transit, right, is a piece of operational technology. There are thousands of processors on board a rail car nowadays. If you go back just 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case, right? So a lot has happened very quickly and very recently in this area. Where we start to see things become more of a challenge that haven't been historically a challenge for the OT side of the house is this interconnectivity we're starting to see between the IT environments and the OT environments. They used to be physically, logically separated from each other. They didn't talk to each other. OT very often did not talk to the outside world. It wasn't necessary. There was no internet connection for it. That changes very, very much now. I think it'd be very rare that you would find a piece of OT that was off the grid still 100%. Now, there are tremendous amounts of technologies you can try to protect it, but nothing, almost nothing is 100%. And actually, we're going to talk through one example of how this was, how a compromise occurred to get past what one country thought was a completely off the grid component of their OT environment. Why do we connect them though? Because the data that is on the OT side of the house is very valuable to make good business decisions, to make efficiency decisions, right? So for us, for example, if I can get data from a train that tells us when the oil needs to be changed versus just pulling the train in and doing it every 2 weeks regardless, right? If the train is good to go for an extra week, we can save a lot of money by not going through that extra step. But we also want to look at live data the heat of the train or other kind of safety measures, right? Safety indicators that historically would only be available to somebody if you were physically on board, the train operator. And now we can make more, smoother, faster decisions from a centralized location like our command centers by pulling that data. The problem is when you build those bridges, you allow the adversary to navigate those bridges into an environment that has traditionally been very poorly secured because it was physically separated from the internet. And that's just not the case anymore. So adversaries now can move laterally in order to try to exploit those technologies, or move from the OT side of the house back into your information technology environment where your business systems sit, where financial data may be. The other thing that's really interesting right now is, again, very much related to that conversation, is we're all living through it right now, is the advent and now dramatic expansion use of IoT, or Internet of Things, connecting things to the world that never were before, right? And of course, we all, whenever you're in these kind of conferences or on various calls, the joke is always the toaster that can now talk to your smartphone, right? Or the coffee maker and so forth. But that's true. Those are forms of IoT. But from a corporate sense or a very large agency sense, IoT are those things that might allow something that is physically disconnected from the network to now have a wireless connection to gather data. And that wireless connection, again, is all it's necessary for that bridge to be established, and then you can exploit. So you can imagine someone like me working in the rail sector, that if my train is now connected to the outside world, but my train has not been properly secured, the nightmare scenario then is that an insider can navigate through some weak point in the network, move laterally across it, and find their way onto the train systems directly, where we might have riders. And what would be the ultimate intent there if you're a terrorist, if you're another state actor, and so forth, right? So where do we see the market? This is a European chart, right? But regardless, it's really the same thing, whether it's here in Europe. It's the expansion of IoT. And you can see from the last, for a 6-year period, the tremendous just growth that we're living through right now. And like all things technology growth, security is very often an afterthought, if at all considered, right? It's rapid push to get something on the streets available, get it, sell it before somebody else invents it before you. And that sometimes comes with risks or compromises. So let's talk about one specific one, right? I like to give real examples of things that have happened in the world, and this one was with Target. And so what happened with Target, right, is this was back in 2013. They lost 40 million credit card numbers. Many of you may remember. You might have been a little too young. But certainly it happened not that long ago and had a big impact on the industry as they looked at, were they doing enough to protect their consumers? And the way in which this attack occurred was through their HVAC system. The adversaries here used third-party connectivity to do maintenance on their HVAC, got into the system that way. The system was connected to corporate networks because they wanted to monitor, I'm sure, temperatures in storerooms or in actual shopping centers and so forth. And so they navigated laterally off of the HVAC system, found their way into the repository of customer data and credit card information, and exfiltrated it. And they didn't even know it was happening, which this is a pretty common thing. They didn't know about it until the FBI notified them. Because what oftentimes happens in these cases is that the people stealing the credit cards don't want the credit cards themselves. They want to put them on the dark web and sell them to as many people who would like to exploit those credit cards as possible before the banks lock them out or make them invalid. And that's what happened in this case here. So this is a great example of why now cybersecurity is not just focused on a certain set of business applications, but we've got to look at the entire network environment and everything, our particular, again, whether it's a local government or a federal agency, it could be a small business, it could be a large business, it really doesn't matter. These are the threat vectors that are being exploited. So who's doing the exploits? It's always good to quickly refresh on this. And the reason why, from a cyber perspective, we look at them differently and we treat them differently. And the kind of tools you use and the approach you use to defend the organization varies very much based on who's targeting you and why they're targeting you. And so nuisance threats are the things we all get every day. We all get 75 emails, a day trying to sell you something. It's all junk. It's all spam, right? There's most likely some kind of malware embedded there. But these attacks are not, there's two critical components of types of attacks, and that is whether or not they are targeted and or persistent. And nuisance attacks are neither of those things. On the right side, we'll skip over the middle two, are your hacktivists and your insider threats. Now, is an insider threat a targeted? Absolutely, right? They're in the organization and looking potentially to do harm, or just through negligence to do harm to the organization. So it can be willful or not willful negligence that can be insider threat. But they aren't persistent, right? If they are persistent, they probably are becoming a criminal. There's a criminal element to what it is they're doing at that point. So when we look then at organized crime and state-sponsored, the reason why these are really important to us as an organization, even a transit organization, is because they're both targeted and persistent. They have a goal, and they're going to keep trying to achieve that goal as long as what you have is of value to them. And what you have varies based on what you do. So when I was at the FBI, obviously, both organized crime and state actors, more state actors though, were very much interested in the secrets that we held, right? The classified information. So that kind of actor, the kinds of advanced persistent threats, which we're going to talk about in a second, the kinds of those actors are very different than who's interested in WMATA, in rail cars, right? Organized crime, more likely to come after us. I see nexuses where state actors would have a play. I think it would be tethered to, when you look at transportation, I think it'd be tethered to larger political issues. But we see this play out all the time. We impose sanctions on Russia. This happened yesterday. And Russia then in turn does something else back to us. And it doesn't have to be an exact match in terms of the tactic they use or the reason why they target an organization. So maybe disabling our transportation system in for the federal government is a proportional response to the sanctions we placed against them yesterday, right? So we have to think like that in this global world. And this is what our cyber analysts are doing every day to try to protect us. So therefore, we have to rely on, we can't protect against everything 100%. It is not possible to have a perfect security solution. I wish it were, but I wouldn't have a job if that was the case, if we had figured this out. So we have to rely on intelligence, and that's the overall point of this. If you're going to reduce your risk from targeted persistent threats, you've got to use an intelligence-based approach to focus your resources where you think they're going to have the most impact. Specifically, look at APTs for a moment. If you're in cyber or you're studying cyber, you might have encountered this acronym. It's been coined by law enforcement, FBI, and so forth. A long time ago, and now they come with names, right? So each APT is generally state-sponsored. There are criminal APTs as well, and sometimes they're a hybrid of both. North Korea is a great example of that. North Korea uses its APTs to steal money, and then to use the money to actually do espionage or have political impacts on their enemies, because they can't afford their own cybersecurity their own cyber attack program. So they have to fund it through crime in order to, it's a very interesting model they have over there, but a very poor country. So, but that's the way they've been clever, right? They fund their own espionage through cybercrime. Russia, on the other hand, is not set up like that. And so this is just an example. There are many, many APTs. The point, though, that I'm driving towards on this slide is that APTs are not a group of folks sitting in their basement somewhere. They are funded, even mostly covertly, right? Nobody wants to acknowledge this funding exists or this relationship exists, but they are funded and provided intelligence by these federal entities, like the FSB in Russia or SVR. So they do a lot of the dirty work, but they can do it with a bit of immunity and anonymity that you can't get, right, if you're an actual agency of a country. So that's how a lot of these are spawned. But we all know that who they really are, right? So it's we kind of see through that at this point. But APTs, the goal of an APT really, in vast majority of cases, is to go undetected. They want to get in and stay in your environment as long as possible, extract as much data as possible, and ideally never even be detected they were there. Right? So if you're, let's say you're Boeing and you are designing the latest strike fighter for the Department of Defense, that's really important information for Russia or China or Iran or North Korea to get their hands on. But they don't want you to know they've got it, right? Because they want to steal it quietly and then build it themselves, or have counter defenses to it in place if possible. Oftentimes they're going to exploit 0 days. That's a pretty common trend, right? A 0 day being a vulnerability that has not yet been exploited or is not even known. And so you want to use it before anyone else even knows is there, so that your traditional defenses through your firewalls, through your antivirus solutions, Microsoft, Palo Alto, and so forth, they want to block. Eventually, once they become aware of it, they'll start to put patches in place, or the actual software and the actual software will put protections in place to do updates. One that's really a great example of an APT taking action and it having an impact on operational technology, right? To get back to the heart of what I want to talk about today, is a well-known attack called Stuxnet. So I'm going to boil this down to just 2 slides. But I highly recommend you can read up on it and study it. It's a great, interesting cyber attack. So this goes back to 2009. There was elections. We were in Iran. There's elections between the incumbent, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and Mir Hussein Mousavi. And it was expected to be a very close election. And so the entire international community was watching to see the results of this election play out. And 2 hours after the polls closed, Ahmadinejad is declared the winner by a 63% landslide. This is huge and wasn't expected. And so internally, Iranians protest for many weeks afterwards. And internationally, there was a significant amount of outrage. And so look, the graphic, the map graphic just shows you Greens were generally not going to push back. No shock there that Russia, China, North Korea, and then most of the Arab nations don't want to, annoy their neighbors. So generally just don't ignore it or don't have an issue. And of course, the Western world was very doubtful about what was happening in this situation. So now let's get through to the actual cyber response to this. So Iran has a uranium enrichment plant that goes through a series of just failures that they cannot pinpoint after the election. A centrifuge failure, right, which damages valves, degrades enrichment. Inspectors come in and they also discover failing centrifuges, right, because Iran is subject to IAEA inspection. And then almost right a year later, computers are still failing. So a year this goes on of failures that they can't figure out what's going on. Turns out there was a virus in the system that was designed to cause physical damage. And what's unique about Stuxnet is this was the first, if not one of the first viruses that was aimed, that was not aimed at stealing data, but was aimed at causing physical damage to operational technology. So this was unseen before, right? This is just a decade ago. And the target was these Siemens computers, who were the supplier of this centrifuge software. And what ended up happening, what was the really clever component of this, was a thumb drive was left on the ground at the third party, left on a parking lot. And an employee of Siemens picked it up and said, wow, look, free thumb drive. Great. Brought it inside, plugged it in, and that kicked off the malware. And we're in Europe at this point. We're not in Iran. We're in Siemens headquarters or Siemens plant back in somewhere in Europe. The malware is able, through an update, to make its way into an otherwise closed off system. Iran had not connected this uranium enrichment plant to the outside world. They thought they had done a good job of separating their OT environment out, and it was this virus found its way in through a very unique way, which could ultimately, we won't, nobody ever 100% claimed responsibility for this, but it would not be beyond the capabilities, we'll say, of Israel or the United States to have pulled off something like this. And not surprisingly, and very coincidentally in terms of timeliness, I think this happened last week. There was another issue in one of these plants with they lost power, I think, and I think we're going to find that was again attributed to a cyber attack meant to in reprisal of some of the things Iran's been doing. So let's switch back now to transportation. How does this world keep, right? So now we understand how APTs act, how getting to OT can really have a significant impact on a country or a corporation. And so just focusing on rail, right, to use one example of the way the world is changing very rapidly is trains of the future. And some of these are already in play. Some of these are improving and some of these aren't yet here. But it's not just about operating the trains. When we talk about OT, when we talk about integrating technologies, it's about the whole experience of whatever it is you're delivering, in this case, moving people, right? So you might want to go to a ticketless access. We in DC are the first full system to deploy mobile payments. So you can use your iPhone and Android phone to swipe, use Apple Pay to swipe and get into the system. So we're pretty proud of that technology, but every one of those innovations comes with a lot of cybersecurity requirements. And we're doing it everywhere because we want to improve. We want to get especially after COVID, we want to step revenue back up again. So it's about the whole experience, and every major project is tied to technology at this point. The other challenge that we have, though, is where we buy from. So we want to do all these new cool things, but we source it globally. And this is where the supply chain component of cybersecurity comes into play. And we've seen this grow tremendously in the last 5 years, is how do we interact with our vendors, our suppliers? Doesn't matter if they're developing, in this case, right, it's an example of an airplane coming from being globally sourced. But even if software is developed, the vast majority of software, well, not vast majority, software is developed all over the world. Silicon Valley does a great job, but China does a great job, and we use a lot of it. So does Japan, and so does the rest of the world. When it is sourced globally, that means that there aren't necessarily, and there are not, universal standards around what a minimum set of security requirements are. The United States tends to follow NIST standards. We like that. We like ISO standards. But China may not care too much about this. And so when we're buying things, what we're finding is companies now have to use their cybersecurity professionals to write requirements into contracts so that what we buy is delivered in a secure fashion that meets our standards. If you don't do that, it's very difficult to go back to a train or to a plane or something else and try to, because it's very customized software. We're not talking about running O365 on an airplane, right? So the software is very customized, very specialized. Adding security can be very expensive, and in some cases not even possible, because if it's not designed, if security is not baked in and designed as a part of that creation process, that SDLC process, you're going to end up with a situation where you can't apply security because it could actually break the application, and that's not good. So living in a global world poses many challenges, not just because of threat actors, but also the way in which we build and supply things. And this is a great way where adversaries do like to exploit it, though, right? So any weakness in this process, our adversaries will absolutely try to exploit and take advantage of. And it doesn't matter if they have to interfere with the supply chain process itself, or just simply exploit some other weakness that's there. The manufacturing design process, if it's not done securely, is always, it can end up in the same result, which is data compromise, reputation impact, right? Think about Target after that breach. How many people stopped shopping at Target? They took a trade. Not only did they lose 40 million credit cards, but they lost billions of dollars in revenue by shoppers not being confident online or even in store. Right? The reliability or the safety of the product that you have, depending on what it does, and all of this translates into lost revenue if you're an actual company. So when we talk about it, right, this is why I focus a lot on the supply chain, because as cybersecurity professionals or folks thinking about going into cybersecurity, there's so many jobs, there's so many places where career fields intersect now. You could be somebody who's a procurement professional or somebody who's a finance professional and now have to really understand to some degree some of the cybersecurity nuances of what it is you're doing, because everything is interconnected. And so we've got to hold everyone accountable now for developing, deploying smart, secure technology, whether that's application, software, IT, OT. The other problem we have, though, in cybersecurity is that we're oftentimes playing catch up from decades of investment. And so an organization like mine that was started in the late 60s, we've been buying technology, obviously different technology, but some of our trains are well over 20, and same thing in New York, it's even, the problems exacerbated even more. You can find trains that are still running and they're fine, but they were designed 30, 40 years ago and they're still in operation. And now we take some of the IoT and start stacking it on. So we're not just protecting what's new. We have to go back and look at decades of legacy technology and figure out, can we even secure it without breaking it? And if not, what's the cost of replacing it? And for, everyone's on a budget, that's a very difficult proposition in some cases. So my last slide, I'm going to deviate from the otherwise normal topic because I think everyone's always interested in this, right? Especially if you've got a group of folks who are getting ready to graduate soon or have recently graduated. What does it look like out there? Well, here's what I'll tell you. The demand for cybersecurity is extremely high. It is an under-resourced area, which is great professionally. It means that there's plenty of opportunities anywhere in this country to go get started, especially if you're walking out with a bachelor's degree that's in some kind of technology background, pretty easy to make your way in. And the salaries pay very well. In a larger city like DC, you can easily walk into a job making 65, 70,000 as a starting salary and grow very quickly. And so, this top chart here just kind of shows that average right now for a cyber analyst. And the moment you get into management, you're in the low to mid 100s for a normal size 100,000K range for a normal mid-size company. And I would say, once you get into the upper management, the director level, or even CISO level, which, again, it's right now the demand is so high for cyber leadership that you find a lot of young folks that by the time they're late 20s, they're already into management roles. And so a lot of opportunity opens up pretty quickly right now in these areas, a lot of growth right now. And these are both recent charts from 2020. And then for this year, I think the 76, the salary one up above is from this year. So I put a link, you can Google it, just this DICE 2021 tech salary report. There's a lot more data in that. The bottom chart I pulled from it, but they have a lot of interesting perspectives right now on certifications, things you can do to make yourself more marketable, or it'll give you a sense. So it's not going to tell you what to do, but you'll see that people who have certain degrees or certain certifications, certain experiences, certain areas of cyber may get paid a little bit more. But broadly speaking, I think most organizations are paying pretty standard, decent rates around any kind of career path related to cyber. So yeah, so let me. I will leave it there and see if we got any questions, Mike.
Sure. Well, I'll start us off. So where do you see WMATA moving in terms of security? So as new attacks evolve out of OT and IoT and so on, you're obviously implementing newer technologies like the mobile pay and so on. So where do you see your vulnerabilities coming and how do you plan to secure them?
Yeah, you can't design. So I oftentimes will get a question like, what are you going to do, or how are you going to focus against? We put out our procurement for the latest rail cars. All of our rail cars go in series. So the current rail cars are called the 7,000 series rail cars. The next generation that we're in the middle of procuring right now are the 8,000 series rail cars. And when we started that procurement process and this is a many-year process for us to go down, awarding a contract, getting them to manufacture them and so forth. It's a billion-dollar procurement. We got a lot of interest saying, okay, what if China manufactures them? How are you going to protect that train from China? And I said, I'm not. I'm not going to focus on China specifically. I can't. There's no way to build a program against one adversary. You have to protect against all the adversaries. And so the answer to that really, to me, then focuses on the risk side of the house. I can deploy firewalls and I can get great new monitoring tools, and those are absolutely important. But when you talk about ingesting new technology, establishing secure baselines is really important. Anyone interested in this, DISA puts out what they call STIGs, which are Secure Technical Implementation Guides. And a STIG tells you how to, what the minimum security standards are essentially for that specific kind of technology. And you can adapt those to pretty much anything out there and set up those baselines. So the key then is, do I see WMATA growing and adding even more technology? Absolutely, 100%, zero doubt of that. The way we keep up with it is by ensuring we are part of that design process. When somebody in our organization says, I want to go buy something new, cool, faster, smarter, whatever, that we have a seat at the table and say, great, let's make sure these requirements are built into what it is you're trying to do, and that our staff has a seat at the table when you're actually going through that implementation process. The key is to deploy it as secure. Nothing's perfect, but as secure as possible.
Interesting. Okay. And so I kind of related question to that from Matt. Can you speak to some of the harder aspects of retrofitting modern security practices to very old OT systems?
Yeah. So it really comes down to, yeah, it is a real challenge, especially when you have some really old stuff out there. I will tell you, I went down into our basement of our headquarters about 2 years ago, and I found a machine that was still running like a DOS screen from the 90s, and they had never replaced it. And I said, why do we still have that? And they're like, well, it works. And the technology, more importantly, the technology it talks to doesn't know how to talk to Windows. It doesn't understand a modern OS anymore, right? It was designed to talk to DOS. So if we can't get rid of that computer until we get rid of the actual entire technology behind it. So I said, well, that's interesting, because I can't secure DOS anymore. Like nobody gives up. There's no more updates to DOS system, like that old operating system, right? It is still in the background, right? But the version, there are still elements of it still that exist today in a modern system, but it's kind of baked in. But when you have an old one that was literally designed in the 90s, it's considered end of life. The service life on that ended probably in the early 2000s, meaning it doesn't get updates and patches. Meaning if there's any more vulnerabilities discovered, there's nothing we can do about it. The supplier of it doesn't do anything. So that's a risk, right? So anything that's that old that is still connected, that can no longer be updated, means one, you do a couple of compensating things. You put it behind firewalls that are very restrictive around what kind of data can pass through. You very much limit that, and you can even do unidirectional firewalls, meaning nothing can go. The data can only flow out. Nothing new can come back in. There's kind of layered defenses you can put around really old tech like that. The other thing you get, though, one advantage you get is what we call security through obscurity, which is the thing is so damn old, nobody's trying to compromise it anymore because they don't even bother, right? Like they don't even expect to find that anymore out there. So there's no hackers actively looking for that anymore. It's just not, it's not worth their time. You're going to find 1 in a billion computers that still run that. So they're going for the biggest bang for their buck. So that's one positive side is, probably nobody's even trying to go after that anymore. But yes, so the older stuff, what you're ultimately faced with is the risk of breaking it, though. Is I can do a whole lot of stuff. I can try to do all kinds of security around old and legacy OT. The problem is that interaction, the way just putting an agent on an old computer like that, a monitoring agent, can still crash that computer or crash the program. So we have to do a lot of very careful testing. And if I don't have a lot of that technology to work with in a test environment, which I may not, it really limits, it really like binds my hands as to what I can do with it.
Gotcha. Interesting. And I guess shifting gears from that, how do you think COVID has challenged IT and OT, and has it exposed any unforeseen vulnerabilities in your area?
Yeah, it's not so much COVID as it is telework and remote work. When you have organizations, some organizations have been built on a backbone of telework. These are modern IT organizations that were built in the last 5 years and never intending to have a physical workspace. But the vast majority of big companies, especially like ours, we're all within the network bounds. And what that means is we design security for the 99 percentile. 99% of the people were working in our facilities on our network. So protecting the network and burying off our network from the outside world was always the priority. When you pivot with 2 weeks notice and send thousands of employees to work from home networks and come back, their devices are now off the grid. And it's not easy to monitor devices like laptops, right? The laptop I'm talking to you on, my work laptop right now, was not designed to get updates and patches off network. It relies, because you don't want to right? So when you're administering a large network, you don't want individual users applying patches. That's not how it works. One, they're not going to do it, or two, they're going to have administrative rights and they're going to download a bunch of stuff that you don't want in their computer in the first place. So that patching has to be done through a corporate mechanism. You want to control that, when it goes out. The problem is when it's off network, it's not necessarily able to be reached and read, and that's a problem. So the biggest challenge, I think, that when I talk to all my peers right now, that COVID has forced us to quickly try to adapt and buy new technology. There are ways to do it, but you have to invest in different kinds of technologies for off-network devices. You can get to them through VPN, but the problem is, for most of my folks, an example, we work through O365. The vast majority of what I need to do every day and the most employees need to do doesn't require VPNing into the network. It requires just access to the cloud. And so you use your own internet connection for all that. So that's the biggest challenge that I think my peers have faced, that we all have faced in moving to a telework workforce, is just changing your mindset and making different kinds of investments.
Gotcha. And back to what you talked about with 0 days. So what type of 0 days have you experienced in Malo?
We have not experienced, we've experienced what anyone else has experienced, which are the larger ones that deal with, so SolarWinds, right? The SolarWinds breach from 6 months ago, Microsoft Exchange servers. We get faced with the big ones you see. Everything we run, we tend to run typical large company technology, which is Microsoft based or SolarWinds based and so forth. So I wouldn't point to anything, and I probably wouldn't announce it publicly anyways. If we had something that was very specific to us, I would say we are subject, though, to what every other major company is facing, which is exploiting those that come out very quickly that are aimed at widespread technology. And that's quite frankly, is part of the business. It's part of the risk every day that we all face, and it's why we all have jobs. Because you have to quickly, rapidly respond to those kind of unknowns, which requires things like, when SolarWinds happened for us, we run that, as do there are, the vast majority of companies use SolarWinds for network monitoring and activity. It's a really, really common tool, and there's very few players in that area. So it was smart. The adversary was very smart targeting SolarWinds, targeting that device that company makes. Because it's so widespread. Saying that's why Microsoft gets hit so often is Microsoft is the 90th percentile of everything, what every corporation runs, right? So yeah, so I would say that nothing earth-shattering there in terms of what we face. It's pretty common.
Gotcha. And so I guess tying into what you're talking about with SolarWinds, how do you secure those third-party risks?
Some you can't. We run 2 data centers in this organization. We have cloud-based technologies. The total number of just devices we have on the network is tens of thousands of them. Which is, we're not just that with 19,000 employees, yes, clearly we have a lot of just, phones and laptops and desktops, but beyond that, the amount of infrastructure behind the scenes it takes to make trains run is huge. I think I would say that we, not just us, but the vast majority of companies haven't done a great job at third-party risk. You inherit third-party risk in some unique ways, though, which you can start to control if you're smart about the language and the requirements. Some third parties will require direct access to your network to provide updates. And you find this most common in very niche kind of hardware, software. It happens for us in rail, that they produce a application for train command and control, right? There's only a few companies, honestly, in the world that do that. And they have, compared to something like Microsoft or SolarWinds, very few customers, right? Like there's only, they may have, 500 customers total around the world that use that. And so they're very much focused on those. And so in order to do their updates, they often want direct access. How you facilitate that securely? Well, you can do it securely or you can do it not. And what I think historically a lot of organizations have done is they've allowed that access, saying, well, I trust this individual. We know who they are. Sure, I trust Bob, the guy at company X. We don't think he's a bad guy. But the problem is, if company X has little or no cybersecurity practice, it's more about that lateral movement. It's about, let me compromise them, right? And then move into your network, take advantage of that secure connection that you've established. So the connection is secure. I can trust the connection, but if their network is compromised, then that's a problem, right? Honestly, it's the same problem we have with what you call BYOD, right? Bring your own device. The moment you let somebody else's device on your network, you bring all of their malware from their device into your environment. And this is why most companies aren't going to allow it, not without some kind of container solution or something that limits the functionality of what they can do, because there's just a lot of risk. So not an easy thing to do with third parties. I would say that, I talked about briefly in the presentation, how I think where we're getting smarter is in our procurement process. Before we engage now in business with somebody, we're setting those expectations up front that they will maintain a security posture and that we can trust and that we can validate. And it's still a risk though. It's just the risk of doing business. At the end of the day, there's very little I can do to stop some of these companies. They can tell me they're going to have a good security program. They can tell me they're going to do certain things. I can't get into their network. They're never going to let me actually go in their network and scan them and look at their setup, nor would I have the time to do it. So a lot of it is still based on trust, and that means, yes, risk that you just have to accept to do business.
All right. And one more question. Have employees expressed privacy concerns with company devices? And if so, how do you balance that?
With which kind of devices?
Company devices.
Yeah, you always get this. Here's the bottom line, though, that any good lawyer will tell you, is you have zero right to and should have zero expectation of privacy on a corporate device. It's our information, it's our data, it's our technology, and that's the way we generally get around that. Is legally speaking, you have no right to privacy on. Now, that doesn't mean I can turn on your camera and see you in your house if you've got a take-home device. That's not what I mean. But I mean that when you send an email out, when you store something, right? If you choose to store your personal medical information on our computer and one of our guys finds it, not like we're hunting through your computer, but if you turn that device in and somebody comes across it, you accepted that risk, not us. Now, that doesn't mean, though, right? So I say that first blanketly because just generally the approach you have to take when it comes to some degree of privacy. But you'll find that in most login statements, and maybe even at your school, it'll tell you that. Usually, you might not read the fine print, but oftentimes you'll see a disclaimer when you log into a network that says, this is the property of X, right? This company, this agency, this university, whatever. And we have full right to track, monitor everything. Now, that's different than you being on Gmail, right? Now, Google, though, will give you a sense of privacy because you are using it as a private citizen in order to send a message to somebody else. Google is different, right? So it depends on the business you're in. If you're an employee of Google and you're sending messages inside of Google for business reasons, probably zero expectation of privacy. But as a consumer of the product, I would expect privacy. So we do have to have concerns, so in terms of employees on our devices, that's different. Customers is different too. So customers have an expectation of privacy, right? They're not employees. If they give us their credit card information, they expect it is going to be kept secure. If they are writing on our networks, writing physically on our networks, not our digital networks, but our train network. If they're writing on that system and we have CCTV on, there's areas of gray area there as to what can be done with that, right? Generally, you give up the right to privacy when you're in a public space like that. So these are complicated questions. It really depends on the use case. But I think generally speaking, when it comes to just employees in our network, that's the way we look at it.
Gotcha. And now, I guess directing our attention to APTs, as you presented earlier, are you running APT scenarios through red teams to prepare for worst case attacks?
Yep. Red teaming is an advanced function. You won't find it at small organizations. It's a very costly thing to do. And quite frankly, when you run out of money, it's usually the last thing that you focus on but it's very valuable. It's a proactive function. We red team it depends on depends on your organization. If you're a big bank, absolutely. Are you red teaming against APTs all the time? 100%, because organized crime threats are huge, right? Because you're moving money. In my organization, I'm less focused on those big APTs, and I'm more focused on the general, looking for IOCs, looking for indicators of compromise, things that are out there. It could be APTs, right? It absolutely could be. Where our red team focuses, I have a 3-person red team, which is good enough for me to get some stuff done. For our size organization, we're doing very good compared to transit in general. 3 people, they tend to focus on, because it takes a lot of planning to do a penetration test. You can, especially we talked about the legacy OT and stuff like that, things that are old. That's another place, pen testing and red teaming. You can break stuff very, very easy. So we're very cautious about where we apply it in our environment. But oftentimes it's used in compliance areas too. So we use it to validate our compliance. So for example, credit card information in the United States, has to meet payment card industry standards, PCI standards. Which means we get audited every year. Anyone who takes credit cards, processes credit card information has to pass that PCI annual audit, or Visa and MasterCard will just not do business with you. They'll blacklist you, and you won't, which makes your doing business really difficult if you don't have them. So oftentimes each year, the pen test team, the red team, will go out and validate security controls that the rest of the team has said are in place. And we want to do that proactively prior to an audit. So a lot of red team time is focused on verifying things. And then, yes, looking proactively at the types of risks, type of threats we're seeing, and targeting high risk systems to test those security controls that you've put in place generally through your risk management process. So I think that answered the question, kind of, hopefully.
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. And do you have any final comments or thoughts to leave us about OT and IT? Or
no, I just wanted to open eyes that it's a really big world out there. A lot of cool stuff that's going on, and this is why the demand is so high to get really qualified people, out there and into the field. So I think it's a great time to be joining cybersecurity, or to be just, even if you're just interested right now. Tremendous amount of opportunities out there, and I think it's a really fun job because it's never over. Every time you think you've secured your technology, the very next day somebody's found a way around your defenses, and you're back at it again. So you can never rest on your laurels. So
great, yeah, thank you. I think I speak on behalf of everyone. We really enjoyed the presentation.
you're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all.